We have this incredibly bloated financial sector. It's a phony crisis. They don't have to be cuts. We know how to get out of a Great Depression. You spend money. If we take a look at the typical worker, they're not doing fine.
Hi, I'm Dean Baker, your host for Mostly Economics. Thank you for joining us today. We have with us Richard Freeman, who's a professor of economics at Harvard. I can go on forever citing his various awards and credentials. He was known as the Dean of Labor Economics at least 2 decades ago, and probably would still warrant that title. So I'm very fortunate to have him here and talk about some of his work over the years. I'm not going to try and get through all of it because we certainly don't have time for that. But there are a lot of things worth covering, worth repeating. So thank you for joining us, Richard.
Pleasure to be here, and I hope you'll thank me at the end because I did a good job.
I'm sure I will. So anyhow, so let me start by going back to what I guess is now ancient history. We're both getting old, but when I first started graduate school in the early 80s, I remember stumbling on your book, What Do Unions Do? And it made a big impression on me because at that time, this might seem strange to people today, unions were seen as, they were powerful organizations. They were messing up the economy because they were pushing for high wages and, work rules and everything. And I found your book just tremendously useful because, at least to me, and you could tell us more, what you see as the most important aspects of it. But what I saw first and foremost was to point out, okay, unions get higher wages for workers, which I think is good, but, obviously that raises costs. But also they can increase productivity, they reduce turnover. They do a lot of things that we might think of as good, just sort of straight economics. So if I could ask you, what do you see as, again, I'm going back ancient history, 40 years or more than 40 years ago now. What do you see as like the highlights of that book?
I think one was that we were looking at things empirically. I was at Chicago for a certain period of time. Some of that book was sort of response to a Chicago version of unions, which had it that the market gives perfect wages and everything is fine, and it must be a bad distortion. And unions, according to one very famous Chicago prof, they raised inequality, which I thought one of our key things was, no, they did not. And how could you argue raising inequality? Well, if you start off with everybody's paid perfectly their marginal product, and one person, pushes up their wage, they're being paid more than somebody equally, good as them, and that's inequality. And of course, if the union is raising the wages of some people, it is true. If it's the union's covering, reasonably skilled or industrial workers, which they mostly did at that point in time, they're going to raise the pay above non-unionized workers. But they also are, of course, cutting down the difference between the wealthy people and working people. And it turns out, of course, in any statistics you look at, that dominates the effect. And I think, in retrospect, that where inequality in the U.S. has gotten much worse than it did when that book was written in our research, and that unions are the most important force we have for reducing inequality. Probably we didn't stress that so strongly, although we stressed very much that unions reduce inequality. But that's a big thing. Then the way the market responds to that, as you say, there'll be lower turnover. That's a savings in the economy. Transitional costs. You have people not moving their human capital from one employer and then losing what you learned at the previous employer, and then this shows up in some productivity changes as well. But I think the key point was you better study unions empirically, not with some perfect economy of versions. And that part of economics that came from that type of perspective was because economists didn't have such great data. And so you kind of could try to force data into or to be consistent with some predilections. And now the profession is completely dataized. And that's a very, very good thing, I think, because you can't argue against evidence if it's
Well, people have tried.
yeah, well, yes, they do. Mostly macroeconomists, but not.
Well, it was a long time, and I don't even know if it's still fully accepted that the minimum wage doesn't necessarily lead to unemployment. I mean, obviously, you're very familiar with the work that was done over the years, but it took a lot of studies to get that to be the accepted view. And I'm saying it's the accepted view, but I'm sure we could still find plenty of economists, some of them at the University of Chicago, but other places as well, who are going to insist that raising the minimum wage creates unemployment. So, but yeah, no, that was a huge turn, to my view, for the better. And again, you're mentioning this. Obviously, been in economics longer than I have, but I mean, I was starting, in grad school in the early '80s, the heyday of rational expectations, where everyone's a rational actor, and everything, any government intervention created unemployment, unions created unemployment, created distortions. So the economics profession, and to my view, there's still plenty to criticize in it, but it has changed hugely for the better, certainly from that period. And a big part of that is that, economists look at the data and you argue based on the data. And again, we could have differences. What's good data? What's bad data? Obviously, there's always measurement issues, but, arguing based on evidence rather than, abstract theory was, to my view, a huge shift for the better.
Yeah. Glad you mentioned rational expectations in a sort of negative way, because that was purely an assumption put in to make certain models clear and make it easy. There was never any strong empirical evidence for that's the way people behaved. And when I wrote my thesis, it was not about, oh, I gotta wait for the hand because the lights go off in this office. Now, there it is. If you're not active, and I'm just sitting here. When I wrote my thesis, it was not about unions. It was about choice of college graduates of going into different fields. And there it was that there was a cobweb cycle that when a lot of people went into a field, then they graduated, and that depressed the wages and opportunities. And there was it was a cycle. And the rational expectations people for years come after me trying to say that that was wrong. Or fortunately, I suppose, is when they look at the evidence, they just sort of, because you just see these cycles, and anything you look at, people are not going to be rational expectations kind of characters, etc. And there's obviously there's still a lot of this thinking when there isn't enough evidence to force people to say, okay. Yeah, I once went to, when I was in Chicago, I went to Milton Friedman's macroeconomic course, money and whatever it was called. Not the course, the seminar. And I made all these comments in the seminar, which nowadays Chicago loves, behavioral economics comments. Milton took me aside very nicely, said, I don't want you to come to the seminar anymore. I said, well, why? What's wrong? And he said, it's not that what you're saying may not be right, but we haven't got the tools or the evidence to assess it. So it's just going to confuse everybody. And we can only look where the light shines. The light only shines through competitive theory, which was, I went to Gary Becker's seminar where every time the light said competitive theory was wrong, he just changed the theory, which is the right way to do things. You develop a different analysis. And so you can see I was very much influenced by the Chicago experience.
Yeah, I can imagine. I should probably say a little word because I realize we're both old timers here because, probably a lot of people don't have any idea what rational expectations is. And, just to take the strong form, and you could correct me if I'm being overly crude here. In the 60s, you had Keynesianism develop, kind of the heyday of, let's just call it simple Keynesianism, where they felt that they could master the economy, get inflation and unemployment, determine what the optimal levels were. And rational expectations was kind of a response to that, saying that people will anticipate the outcomes of government actions. So just to take the simplest possible case that, okay, we have this idea, we're going to boost employment we're going to have a big government spending program. We're going to spend $200 billion on whatever, infrastructure, whatever it might be. And that's going to increase government spending, increase demand in the economy, increase employment, all good things. And they go, no, that's not going to work. Because what's going to happen is everyone's going to see, you spent $200 billion more. You increased the debt by $200 billion. We're going to have to pay that back. And because we're going to have to pay that back, we're just going to save more. So what's going to happen is the government will spend more, but people will consume less. So it's not going to do anything. So it's going to be totally pointless. So why do this? That was, that's kind of a strong case. But I think, in the heyday, there were actually a lot of people, maybe they still believe it, I don't know. But if you go back to the 70s, early 80s, that was a very common view, perhaps the predominant view in at least some circles in economics.
Yeah, that's fine. And it wasn't, they used it as assumption to establish some points that they wanted to make. It was never an assumption that they had evidence for it, that people did that.
No, in fact, again, this is kind of a quirk, and no reason anyone would know anything about this. And this is all third, fourth hand. But I had a professor my first year in grad school at Michigan, who was my macro professor, who had studied with Barrow back when he was Robert Barrow was, I guess, one of your colleagues on it. But he had been in Rochester, and my professor had studied with him. And he'd been his research assistant on one of his papers, which purported to show that government bonds did not stimulate the economy. And basically, it was showing. He was trying to show that if people expected the debt, expected the increased spending, it didn't have an impact, but you had to show what was expected, what was unexpected. And he came up with a totally crazy equation. He taught it to us in class. This is why I remember this well. He taught it to us in class, a totally crazy equation for what was expected spending. And one of my friends in the class went to see and said, how did he decide that was expected? He goes, well, that was what fit. And he'd run the regression like 100 times. And this was when it was actually difficult to run regressions. I mean, today we can run a regression 100 times in, seconds. But, back then that was a time consuming thing. But he was determined to get that result. He was getting it for Barrow was determined to get that result. So that was their empirical work. And again, just to point out to people, if you run regressions 100 times, you'll eventually find one that gives you what you want. It doesn't mean anything because, again, our standards of evidence are you wouldn't get by random chance more than 1 in 20 times, or ideally 1 in 100 times. But you run it 100 times, and you expect you'll get that result at least once. So
And the profession moved way beyond that because now you're supposed to do robustness checks, and you still can't get people. People still will, not only in economics, throughout science, people will report a result that gets some attention or is consistent with their views. But now we put some higher standards on it. So I would have to say to you, hey, if you do this with the regression, which you might think sensible and not crazy, you won't get what I said. So
Yeah,
if I
yeah,
reported, I ran 100 regressions, and this is the only one that fits my analysis, but I have such a strong prior for my analysis that this is what we should go on. Well, you can carry me off to the loony bin if you want, but uh, yeah, now just people will ask, well, why didn't you do this? Do five other things that seem reasonable and make sure that the result is robust to
yeah. No, and that's a huge advancement. Now, part of that is the advancement in computer power. So you can easily say, do it this way, do it that way, do it that way. But again, we all recognize the standard. Okay, you have this result with that regression. Here's another perfectly reasonable way to do it. Let's see what result we got. Here's another perfectly way to do it. Let's see what result. And if it comes up half the time, then you look at it. Maybe there's something there. But if you run it 100 times and you only get it once, that doesn't mean anything.
Yeah, no. I mean, the other thing that's happened is that having the big data, millions and millions of observations, tens of thousands for some, say, company studies or industry studies, but you can have millions of people in your analysis, and that's just overpowering. And in the time you're referring to, it was basically, and the kind of work Bob Arrow was, it was time series data almost always, and you only had 20 observations,
Yeah.
and so you in my view, then you learn almost nothing from that kind of an exercise, and you got to have things based on much larger data sets.
So let me step away as much as you and I probably find this interesting. I want to get back a little bit to unions. So, you wrote your book in the early 80s, and the union density rate at that point in time was roughly 20%. I don't know the exact number. You might remember the exact number, but we were somewhere around 20%. Today we're at 10%, and in private sector it's 6%. So not a good story. So, basically, and again, I'll let you fill in here, but basically it's proved very difficult for unions to win organizing drives, and where they were organized, first and foremost in manufacturing, but in other sectors as well. Union shops have downsized, some have gone out of business, and we've just seen a huge fall off in unionization rates. So what do you consider as the big factors that have been responsible for the decline in unions over, let's say, it's 40 years, 4 decades now?
Yeah. Well, I mean, a large fraction of this is that they may raise productivity a bit, but they raise the costs of the wages more, and companies will fight them. And they have many tools, and the government does not lean enough, let's say, against the use of those tools. And then that we have it's one company at a time, unionization. If you compare us to union densities in the European countries, or even stronger, collective bargaining coverage, in France, they extend a contract to every company in the industry. And so there's much more, of course, industry level bargaining. And if there's not an industry group, they'll just take say, a big employer who signs a contract, and that gets extended. And we have very little of that. And we do have three groups of workers, and this is what I'm currently working on, who are joining unions in huge numbers, and they are remarkable. I never in the 80s would I have said they would be the groups. And one it's in the academic world, the graduate students, the postdocs, and there always were some faculty unions, but now we have more growth of adjunct faculty unions, the people who are more precarious. And we're now seeing growth of undergraduate unions, workers. I mean, all of these are workers. I don't mean that they're student unions, just student government, but these are workers. And there's been a big burst in those areas. That's one. The other group that we see this is among residents at hospitals. And they are also having a giant burst in unionism. There are these places will be having, as you said, well, the union density of the country fell over this whole period. It's kind of stabilized now at a certain level. But for these people, that you get when they vote on for unions, you will see 90% of the workers voting yes. 90% is unheard of in the 60s earlier. If you won an election, it was usually pretty close, and the union might be very happy they got 58%, and they would say, wow, that's a big victory. Now you had the postdocs at the National Institute of Health had a 98% vote for the law students at these are employees, law student employees at Harvard had like I don't know, a 90% vote. Also, it's just incredible statistics, just landslides, and it's really having a striking kind of effect on the whole meaning of who is organized and which unions. When Harvard first had their union drives, Harvard fought them like a dog, and I think the unions they lost 2 elections before they finally won, and they won by a small, 55% to 45%. No, and now you talk to students and you say that's the history of the Harvard Union, and they just say, really? But that's incredible. Everybody in today votes for the union, and so we're having a union movement that is getting a lot of influx of young, highly educated people. The American AMA was against unions when I looked at unions, and I mean, and that why? Well, they were at that point. The doctors were mostly private practitioners running their offices, and they certainly didn't want to unionize, and they didn't want their nurses unionized. They didn't want, they were small business people. Well, now I don't know, 70+% of the doctors work in big hospitals. They are not private owners of private businesses, and boom, they see what goes on in a big, it's not industrial, but it's semi-industrial hospital. And they have problems. They want to do something for a patient, and the supervisor may say, it's too expensive. Can't you find a cheaper solution? Doctors are trained that, they should be making the decisions. And then you can go to think of other workers as well, that part of the union effect is through what I used Albert Hirschman's term, voice. They're speaking up, and they know. And if you have a good company, you know that your workers know things about productivity and other stuff that you, the boss, don't know. And you better rely on them and make them part of the operation. They got to have ability to stop some things if they think it's dangerous. They got to have ability to do other things. So we have this new burst of unionism, and the UAW now, I believe 1/5 of their members are now basically graduate students and other people. UAW has been incredibly, whatever the right word should be, they just made this transformation much quicker, realizing, oh, there are people who want unions there. And so we do have a very divided by union group. There are like 4 unions that have the bulk of the academic workers, or maybe 6, depending on what do you mean by bulk. And we have a Teamsters union that has organized PhDs in one Massachusetts university. So we have this burst, and we made it. Originally, my project was going to be, will this spread over to other young people? Then will this end up being a generational kind of a union spurt?
I think, this is great to see, but I think part of what's important about it is to give a different image to unions because, traditionally people thought of unions as industrial workers, manufacturing, maybe construction, that's obviously the sectors they were strongest in. But to see them getting into new sectors, and I'm going to boast a little because I did play a little bit of a role in when I was at the Economic Policy Institute. We organized the staff there, the economist, the development, the communication staff. It was wall union. It included everyone in that. And that then picked up in other places. I was management. I'm now a union member again at the Center for Economic and Policy Research. So I'm again in the same union. And that's spread to a number of the nonprofits, I was going to say in D.C., certainly in D.C., but really across the country. So that's, in the scheme of things, it's still, we have a workforce of 160 million people. It's not tipping the scales there yet, but the point is it is growing. It's been a good thing. And, again, insofar as people see that, because again, when we were organizing at EPI, I remember we had people, the communication staff, the development staff, they were saying, well, we're professionals. Our unions for us. It was a lot of discussion, and that was good. And we ended up voting on it. It ended up being unanimous. It was great.
But now that's not what you hear at all. It would be, we're professionals, and we've got to protect our professional thing against, let's say, companies that want to do things less professionally, possibly dangerous, like the patient's health or something, in order to make more money. And so yes. Now the problem is, you sort of is implied, is we could organize all of the college employees, or graduate students, and that's not, in a big country, that many people. We could organize all of the residences in the hospitals, and scientists, engineers, and university graduates we're a larger fraction of the workforce than we were 40 years ago, but we're still not the majority. And some of the unions which outside of these places that did have spurts and were public sector unions, school teachers and so on. So those have also been successful. But the spread has got to go now from the more educated young people to the high school graduate type people. We looked at what was happening with Starbucks, and I was thinking, Starbucks, great place for contagion, because all the baristas are pretty young people, and they have some. I don't know what it is. It's probably a little bit less than 10% of Starbucks are unionized at this point, and they don't have contracts, so that you're having your union there without getting a collective contract in general. There may be some Starbucks has a contract, but it's not standard. And it turns out those are places near the Starbucks that got unionized are places near universities. So it did look to me as if, maybe we will see this kind of phenomenon. Now, our project is taken a turn because of what you referred to. I said Harvard's in trouble. The whole of higher education and the whole of science in the country. So we organize. We get some better benefits for people, and well, if the U.S. government cuts the NIH grants, all the postdocs are fired, and Harvard has been forced to let go postdocs. There's no money to pay them. The projects are not doing anything because the projects are not being funded. And if you look at the budget that the current administration today is offering for next year, we will see they will have squashed this area of unionization. It isn't the unions that are driving the government. It's actually the science I think they don't want, because it comes up with results that they don't fit their priors or whatever is driving them. Um, so our project was going to
we have very difficult times at the moment, and it's a little distressing where, you have made some progress in, the growth of unions, obviously in, the professional with, the postdocs and graduate students. But, again, obviously a lot more people employed in Starbucks and places like that. And it's great to see the progress, but we clearly have a very anti-worker, anti-union administration, and as you say, anti-science. RFK Jr. was just testifying. I think it was today. I always get my stuff on the web, and I'm never that sure. There's a reason to know whether it's today or yesterday, but I oftentimes don't know. But anyhow, I think it was today, and he was being asked about he had just dumped his vaccine advisory commission, and these are 17 people. Maybe one. I've heard of several of them. I'm not an expert in the area, so maybe there was one or two you could say should have been dumped. But he just dumped 17, and then he picks 7 or 8 people, many of them with no background in vaccines at all. So it's it's a little more than a little disconcerting, and it's unfortunate for these people, as people with expertise in the area, they have careers, and you're throwing them out the window. But it's also unfortunate in the sense that it's a very practical matter. We need vaccines, and let's hope there's not another pandemic like COVID. But we need the flu vaccine for the fall. And if we don't have a flu vaccine that's effective, that's going to be real bad news for a lot of people that are in bad health, that are older. That's the reality. Vaccines do. We don't have to pretend. Vaccines do protect people from serious illnesses. So.
Well, the senator from Louisiana, Republican senator, who is chair of his committee, is very upset about this as well. He's a doctor. He's got an MD background. And I just forgotten his name right now. Cassidy, yeah. I think it's William Cassidy. And you would hope that this would feed through. President Trump, when he caught COVID, they had the best medicines. He recovered from it. He pushed the viral speed, or whatever it was called,
Warp Speed, Operation Warp Speed.
Yeah, and I doubt that he has much. This is not one of the issues that really it would excite him, if I could phrase it correct. So he picked somebody, and the Congress approved, who will bring some harms to our health, and even if they replace him soon, there's going to be harms.
It's frustrating. We all followed it closely during COVID, with waiting for the vaccines, and the growth of the anti-vaccine movement was just amazing, and again, based on no evidence, really quite the contrary. I mean, the evidence was overwhelming that vaccines, prevented, well, first off, prevented people from getting COVID originally, but then more importantly, prevented people who got it from getting seriously ill and dying. And, that at the end of the day, I mean, best not to get it all. I had it. I was rather have not gotten it, but the fact was I wasn't seriously ill. It didn't knock me out for a long time, and certainly never in danger of dying. And again, I don't know if I'd have been in danger of dying if I didn't have the vaccine, but the point was I didn't have to worry. I didn't end up in the hospital, and again, I'm not going back. That's my personal anecdote, but I mean, we have reams of evidence that people who were vaccinated were much less risk, certainly of dying, but even being seriously ill, hospitalized, and to have this anti-vaccine movement that people are just saying absurd things, that people were dying from the vaccine. And obviously, we had, I don't know what the numbers are, most people in the U.S. thankfully were vaccinated. I'm sure it was well over 200 million. And yeah, some of those people died because if you have 200 million people, some of them are going to die. But again, this has been very carefully studied. And, if they had any evidence, and again, it's one of these things, they call themselves vaccine skeptics. And, I've had occasion to get to know some of the scientists who are involved. And they're all, they look for side effects, so if you have, could show evidence. And again, there was the line, the vaccine, which just kind of drove me nuts because there were, there are probably 24 now vaccines against COVID that were developed, here and elsewhere in the world. And, some of them do have side effects. They all have some side effects, I should say. But, none of them are killing people. And the idea that, we have large numbers of people dying from the vaccine is just, literally crazy. But you do have millions of people who believe that.
Well, I think that from the science side, one says, okay, look, this is the evidence we have. And, there's always a possibility that the general science results are wrong. I mean, people believed different things before Einstein thought of something new, and that changed the way they think about things. But for the anti-vaccine, it's that we social scientists did not and still don't study why it is so attractive, let's say the anti-vaccine movement. How come so many Americans buy into it? It's not that they're reading scientific papers, because then they would have a different view. It'd be interesting of the anti-vaccinating scientists exactly how they managed to keep, let's call it their minority view, and there I have some understanding. What you read are only the papers in the journals that have an anti-vaccine thing. You make a big deal out of every study that finds somebody, some negative effect of the vaccines. But then the average person is buying into this, and it's just very. It's like it's our fault in some sense not to have studied what it is that would get the average person to look more reasonably at the evidence, and I think social media maybe has an effect. We haven't educated people to be sufficiently critical in their assessment of evidence, or we haven't been. The scientific community hasn't been. It's like they haven't marketed.
Yeah. No, I take your point. It's a very important point. It's when you see, and I don't know what the numbers are. I'm sure it's at least 20% of the population, might be as high as 30%, really think, the COVID vaccines were harmful, were net harmful. So it's not that you had some side effects, but they were net harmful. And that's so at odds with, all the science. So how does that get to be the case? And, I'm not going to say there's like some simple answer. We could just say, if we just done this. I mean, one thing I will say, much impact it had. There were issues, I think, where, it was the vaccine was oversold. And I remember President Biden said, if you get the vaccine, you won't get COVID, which, was largely true with the original strain. So I remember well the tests, because I was following it, the tests were coming out of the original vaccines against the first strain of COVID. And they had like 90 plus percent would not get it. If you were exposed to it, you wouldn't get it. But what turned out with the later strains, the Delta strain and the Omicron, and I don't know what we're up to now, we've had any number of new strains, it's much, much less effective in keeping you from getting the disease. What it is effective is in keeping you from getting seriously ill. And, to my mind, that's great. That's what we care about. I mean, I'd rather not get a cold, but, I'm not going to die from a cold. But I think it was unfortunate that, Biden made that statement, which I've heard cited all the time by these anti-vax people. And I'm just holding it up because he's the president, obviously a very visible person. But I think, it would have been helpful. And again, I don't know how much it would have changed, but if there had been more care in how people talked about the vaccines.
Yeah, well, that is a correct assessment. But the Democrats, and the Republicans too, but the politicians always do this. They do not want to say, gee, if we put money here, we're not quite sure how much good it's going to do, but we think on average it'll do some good. And our evidence is mixed. They don't say that. They actually. I once wrote to President Obama where he made this statement that the Human Genome Project was incredibly profitable for the economy. I was thinking, what do you mean? We spent a lot of money, but we hadn't at that point. No medicines had come. Even now, it's unclear. We have a lot of medicines coming. And it was, and I spoke to the people in the White House. And I said, well, you can't say this. You're spending money, and then you're saying, well, that's creating jobs. But if you spent money on anything else, you'd create just as many jobs. It's what you're really doing. And they got back to me, and they said, no, this sells among people, and we're not going to change it. I said, oh, well, so you see, I can understand Biden now doing the same thing. Give the simple message, because I don't think the people are sufficiently sophisticated to appreciate that, anytime we're doing something new, a new policy, a new science, we try scientific, new medicine, we try to test them, we try to make sure they work, and sometimes they don't. So there's been this loss of Americans don't trust science or public health people, let's say, as much as they deserved to be trusted. But part of it is self-inflicted. There is legitimate debate over effectiveness of masks in protecting you before the vaccine. And there are a bunch of studies say yes, and a bunch of studies say no, and it's debatable, let's say. I would wear a mask no matter what. I don't, if it's 50-50, as you say, but it's doing no harm, boy, just wear the mask. But there, you may remember when the health officials said, "Oh, you don't need masks," because they thought they really did need them, but there was a shortage and they wanted to get the doctors and nurses the mask first.
That was unfortunate. That was very unfortunate.
Yeah, I mean, you just went, oh boy, and that was the scientists. I think playing the politicians' game. No, you guys should not have said that. You should have said, you could have told the truth. We think the masks are critical. We're not sure, but we want to get the doctors and nurses because they're going to be in contact all the time. And I think most people would have said, okay, that's a reasonable decision. But instead they told a lie.
Yeah. And they paid a big price for it. And the thing, again, obviously we have the benefit of hindsight, but and they did subsequently say this because if you recall, there were shortages of masks, of course, when they recommended people start masking. They said if you can't get a mask, and cover your face with a bandana, it's not as good as, a mask, but it does most of what you want it to do. So, had Fauci, had the others made a point of saying we have a shortage, we do need to let medical personnel get them. So, everyone shouldn't be going out trying to buy a mask, but you can cover your face with, something else, with a bandana, with a scarf, whatever it might be. And that will mostly serve the purpose. And, again, we have the benefit of hindsight, so we could say that would have been much better. But I don't think there's any doubt we paid a big price for that because it just undermined trust.
That's so it's winning the trust of people for rational policies. But if the truth is, we can't be sure that a particular policy that we like is necessarily going to do that much good. Most of our evidence is going to be, well, it worked in Minnesota. Maybe it'll work in Alabama. We have something for Minnesota, but maybe it won't. People in Alabama are different. It's warmer climate. It's a different, I think, mix of people, different culture. You just go down the list, say, well, maybe it won't work. So now it could be that if you told the truth of these things, you would lose all support. Maybe it's better that you tell your people, let everybody just do this because the leader says so, and or because the science says so. But all of those things, I suppose, have got to be studied carefully. What is it that ultimately leads in a democratic society people to make, better choices? And sometimes they won't. But on average, we sort of more traditionally said, just educate people, tell them the truth, and it'll work out in the end.
Yeah, I think you and I are both old-fashioned in believing that. I hope we hope we end up being right, but we'll see. We'll see. Well, thanks a lot. I've taken a lot of your time here, but I really appreciate it. I could go on forever. I mean, there's so much material that I'd love to cover, and we just scratched the surface. But I don't want to take your whole day here. But thanks for your time, and hopefully, we'll come back. I'll drag you on here again before too long.
Okay, thanks. It was a pleasure.
If you like what you just saw, please help us out by liking us and subscribing. Thank you.